Hey, before I get into the teaching, I want to introduce some of you, if you haven't met her yet. Jenny Olson. There she is. Fantastic. That's your mic. So I got to know Jenny through this thing that we're both involved in called the First Five Napa Network. We got to know each other a little bit before that with some Martin Luther King weekend planning stuff. But Jenny has a remarkable story of how she came to start Teens Connect in Napa, which, as Dar mentioned, is going to start using our youth space to help her program flourish. So tell us about how that all got started and what you hope for.
How much time do I have?
You have 55 minutes, yeah.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi, thank you so much, Pete, for bringing me up here to share my message of my work through Teens Connect. I actually didn't start working with teens. My career was in graphic design. I had my own business in Napa for 20 years. But as my teens became teenagers, and I started looking for ways to be involved with them, and most importantly, to introduce them to service work, I basically found my calling over the years. And I knew that our teens needed support more than ever today. And so I just developed a program that was based around introducing teens to volunteer work, both locally and globally. We travel on service trips every year. In 2016, Napa lost 2 teens to suicide. And that's when I realized I needed to do something more that really helped teens connect to themselves and not just teaching them to connect to others. So I started Teens Connect, gave up my design business. This is the short story. I have a 5-hour version too. And we partnered with Mentis, a local mental health organization, and we provide free therapy for teens who need it. We are on our programs. Our programs are prevention-based, but then we partner with professional therapy, the program I was just talking about. Our prevention programs, we're working on 10 different middle and high schools in Napa County right now in just under 2 years. We get together with teens, we talk about wellness, we talk about what's going on in their lives, what they need in their lives, we connect them to service opportunities, to yoga and wellness, meditation opportunities, art opportunities, anything that helps bring meaning to their lives. And we've been kind of popping around Napa at different places who will let us use their spaces because we've grown tremendously. And I'm just so grateful for Pete and Crosswalk for allowing us to start meeting here. And once we start having regular meetings here, everybody is welcome. Any teen in Napa County is welcome. So I'm hoping to be able to talk more about what we're going to start doing at Crosswalk. And then if you know any teens, please invite them to be involved because we're inclusive. We want anyone any teen who wants to connect to others. Give them a place to sort of be together. That's basically what we're about.
That's awesome. Doesn't that sound cool? All right, that's what we're doing.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Jenny. Very, very, very excited about what Jenny's going to be doing with Teens Connect here. That's a total God thing that she's doing. The Spirit of God is all over what she's been doing and what she's going to continue to do. And like she said, she is the embodiment of inclusivity. And so hopefully we'll spread that word and see great things happen through you. So that's awesome. One other good news thing. When I offered the space to Jenny, knowing in this case that I knew we had it and it would be a great way for us to impact youth in the community, I was reminded of a conversation that I had a few years ago with Tracy Lamb, who runs news here in town. She's a remarkable leader. And she and I were going to a similar conference on had to do with early childhood education and some resources that the county offers for struggling families and parental education. It was really, really great. And she and I parked in the same neck of the woods in the parking lot and had a long walk to get to the county Office of Education seminar area. And so we're on the way, and she asked me if the church could help her out with a particular project that I knew that we could. And we did for a while, and then that didn't work out, and so we figured out how to help in other ways. But as soon as she put the idea out about, hey, do you think you guys could do this? My first reaction was, and the first words out of my mouth was, sure, yeah, we could do that. And you know what she said after that? She said, I knew that was going to be the answer, because every time we ask, you always say yes. And I didn't realize what a great compliment that was. And it's not just for me, it reflects all of us. But what that has led to. And I was reminded of it with Jenny, but then also just Friday night, I went to receive, on behalf of the church, a gift from the Napa Valley Marathon, which is happening right now. Apparently crazy people run for like 21 or something miles. I don't understand it. Doesn't make sense to me. But anyway, people like to do it, I guess. And anyway, they contacted us in January and wanted to support Crosswalk. And this is the letter that they gave me, and I want to share it with you because it's about you. It's about who we are and who we're becoming. Dear Pastor Peter Shaw, the board of the Kaiser Permanente Napa Valley Marathon would like to thank you for your immense and unwavering contribution to our community through your efforts in multiple projects, work with dozens of local nonprofits, and thousands of our most at-risk community members. We understand that it is through Crosswalk's consistent pattern of stepping up when crises occur that has earned you the designation of an official emergency shelter for Napa County. And I love this little line that somehow got started, but we're known as the first to open, last to close shelter. Love that. Love that. It says, during the sign-up process for the 2018 Kaiser Permanente Napa Valley Marathon, we offered runners an opportunity to support the fire relief efforts in Napa Valley. After reviewing the work of several organizations as possible recipients for the $2,000 donations we received, the Marathon Board has selected the Crosswalk Community Church. We know that you have a tremendous amount of work ahead of you to update your facility to meet the needs of the community as you would like. We are excited to be a little part of that effort. May the preparation be robust and not needed, which is a fun way to say that. So anyway, that's just a tip of the hat to you guys. But yeah, I think it's awesome. You just have no idea. And it all started with some yeses and more yeses to how can we serve the community with what God has blessed us with in this campus. And it's remarkable. The gal who I met was my contact. She just started rattling off all the different ways that we're trying to serve just by opening ourselves up. And it's just awesome. So well done, people. You're nailing it. It's way cool. So you noticed on your question of the day here, how many of you actually decided to give up, answer the question on the truth or dare? Anybody have some good dares out there that you had to do? Joan, you did? No, all right, your hand went up pretty quick. I want to know what that question was for sure. But on this other one, a little easier question, would you rather eat sushi, street tacos, lasagna, fried chicken, or what? And you know, each of these food groups, I tried to pick foods that represented different parts of the world. So sushi, we know when we think of that, we think Japan, perhaps. When we think street tacos, we think Mexico, Central America, South America, perhaps. When we think lasagna, we think Italy. Lasagna, right, Sal? When we think fried chicken, we think... No, we think Scotland. Did you know that's where it actually started? I had no idea. I went down the hall to ask Dar, hey Dar, she knows everything about food because she's such a great cook. I was going to ask her, where'd fried chicken come from? Just assuming it would be the South. And then I decided, oh yeah, I've got Google. So I checked it out. And no kidding, it started in Scotland of all places. I know, crazy. But the whole thing was to get you thinking about nationalities, where you hail from, because sometimes we divide ourselves based on our 23andMe results, you know, where we've come from and our heritage. We're going to talk a little about that today. So Trudy, bring up the stuff today. We're talking about truth as it shows up in John chapter 8. I'm going to introduce you to some names, some of which you know, some of which you probably don't. The first one I'm guessing you have not heard of. I had not heard of this guy. Unless you're in math or philosophy, Gottlob Frege. Everybody say Gottlob Frege. So he was a mathematician in the 1800s who actually did very, very significant work, largely unsung, but his work laid the foundation for other ways of thinking both philosophically and mathematically down the pike. And his whole thing, his light bulb moment, his gift to the world had to do with thinking about sets of things and realizing that if we think in terms of sets of things, then that allows for us to think about order in all kinds of different ways. And I'm in church world, so I don't know how to explain that very well, except for to tell you that he did really important work, all having to do with sets. And his idea was that if we can figure out how to understand sets in our mathematic life, that would bleed over into philosophy as well. And as we're able to apply set thinking to philosophy, it's going to eliminate the need for questions. It's going to eliminate mystery, that we're going to be able to understand everything that happens in our life based on set thinking. However, there were problems with that. And one of the persons that came up to identify that problem was Bertrand Russell. Now, you're probably familiar with him. Bertrand Russell credits Frege for his work in helping him think things through. But Bertrand Russell realized that there were some problems in the way that he thought, and some of the set thinking has to do with binary thinking. How do you separate things out and understand kind of either or? Because that is the way so many things work in our world. And so one of the ways that has been used, at least in a narrative form, to explain the problem of set thinking not being able to answer adequately all the problems of our life was in the story of a barber. So imagine, if you will, a town in Europe where all of the men are clean shaven. Every day, the men are clean shaven. I don't know about the women, but the men are clean shaven. If the men don't shave themselves, they get shaved by the barber. That's the story. So you have a town of clean shaven men. The men are either shaving themselves or they are shaven by the barber. You with me? It seems to make sense for everybody. It fits everybody in town, except one person, which is the next thing on the screen. What if the barber doesn't shave? Because if the barber doesn't shave, then he gets shaved by the barber. You see the problem? This is a very simple narrative form just to say sometimes this binary way of thinking eludes us. Now that may seem kind of like nonsense to you, and why are we talking about that? But philosophers and mathematicians think about this stuff a lot, because they have to design stuff that's going to be completely reliable. And they're thinking about equations that help change the world and change our technology and all this stuff. And so they have to figure out, well, how do we accommodate for this stuff? Which leads me to another guy that I hadn't heard of. His name is Kurt Gödel. Now, I know it looks like Gödel, but it's pronounced like the women's underwear garment from yesteryear, like girdle, but it's Gödel or something kind of like that. And so he came up with the incompleteness theorem, because he also realized that there are problems with our math. And if we can't accommodate mathematically for incompleteness, our not knowing, our incapacity to completely reason out everything, it's going to hurt our capacity to figure out very complex problems. And one of the issues that he figured out had to do with a theorem that you and I are taught from an early age. As soon as we learn what a prime number is, which is a number that can only be divided by itself, or 1, we also learned an interesting kind of fun math trivial fact, which is every even number is the sum of 2 prime numbers. Impress your friends. Every even number is the sum of 2 prime numbers. So you can think through every even number, go as high as you want, and you can figure it out that it is the sum, maybe the sum of other numbers too, but is the sum of 2 prime numbers. But Gödel realized that may not be entirely accurate. Do you know why he knew that might not be a completely accurate statement? Because we never run out of numbers. As soon as we get to the highest number we can think of, some smart aleck throws a +1 in there, and now we got another new number. And our computers just keep going and going and going, and the reality is there just might be somewhere, a million decimals away or 10 billion decimals away, a positive number that is not the sum of two prime numbers. That should trouble you deeply. And so what he realized is that we need to accommodate this incompleteness, that we can say with great reliability that this is true, but we have to leave reason or room for this reasonable doubt that we don't know things as well as we thought. So he came up in a very short way to explain this with the next sentence, which is on the screen, which is simply this: this sentence is untrue. What happens if we look at that and say, true? This sentence is untrue. Well, that completely invalidates the sentence. So what do you do? So he created a mathematical quality, equation, theorem, that can be used by mathematicians to this day, which has been used by mathematicians to this day to do very complex work. Aren't you glad you came today? Me too. I'm not that smart. I came off on this through a podcast I listened to called Radio Lab, and they were talking about loops and thinking this way. Maybe some of you listened to that too. I thought it was fascinating. Well, Gödel actually was a religious man. His wife communicated later. He didn't go to church that much, but he read his Bible every Sunday morning, apparently. He also struggled with some mental health issues, really severe, in fact. And so when he wasn't struggling with that, and part of it was brought on or exacerbated by his deep thinking. The guy couldn't stop thinking about things, and that would add stress to him, and that would lead to other things. And literally, he was institutionalized for periods of time between his writing of brilliance and all this stuff. He once said that religion itself is very good, but religions are bad. Religion is good, religions are bad. And we see why that is in the text that we're going to look at today. So we come to John chapter 8, and this is the only text from John's 8th chapter that I'm going to give you today. There's some other texts we're going to look at, but this is the beginning of a discourse, the beginning of a conversation which turned into an argument very quickly. And there's a phrase that shows up on this screen that is used in political statements. It's used in graduation speeches. Let's see if you can figure out which one it is. So Jesus said to the people who believed in him, "You are truly my disciples if you remain faithful to my teachings. And you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." That's it. Have you heard that in political discourse, graduation speeches? All these people have gone through school. Now they know the truth, and the truth will set you free. But the people replied, "But we are descendants of Abraham," they said. "We've never been slaves to anyone. What do you mean you will be set free?" So let me go back, Trudy. She's too excited to go forward, so go backwards, please. There you are. Thank you very much. So let's talk about this and talk about John and remember what we're talking about. Remember, John was written in response, in part, to the Jewish Christian people being kicked out of the Jewish community. And so when we read something like this, an argument between Jewish people who believed in the faith, but now they're having a hard time with Jesus, this is a reflection in part of the community conflict that came about because Jesus following Jewish people were saying, I don't think we agree with this Orthodox position anymore. And I think we're honoring the wrong things because that's what Jesus taught us in our tradition. Jesus, this devout Jewish man, broke with Orthodox tradition on many occasions. And because the followers of Jesus were doing the same thing, it ended up getting them kicked out of the tribe. So you have that. In the actual context, look who Jesus is talking to. He's talking to people who are on his side, people who are believing in him and wanting to believe in more. So it starts off as the home crowd. We're on the same page. We're all descendants of Abraham, is what's being spoken here. You're one of us. We're together. And yet Jesus challenges the very foundation of their thinking. this is how the argument ensued. They're saying to Jesus, first of all, another example of not getting it. This comes up in John a lot, people not understanding what Jesus is saying. And so Jesus is saying to them essentially this: you're claiming that your Jewishness or your identity is in Abraham. Abraham was the founder of the Jewish religion as well as Islam. And so you're looking at him and you're literally doing a 23andMe analysis and saying to me that you're Jewish because you share the DNA from this particular region. And you know, there are people today that understand themselves to be Jewish just because of that. A handful of us were at a vigil for peace after the Pittsburgh shooting at the synagogue here last fall. And one person stood up and said, well, I'm Jewish, but I don't practice the faith. I'm Jewish, I think he even may have said, I'm agnostic/atheist. And that's kind of what Jesus is dancing with here. He's like, well, you're saying that you're Jewish, but you're claiming kind of the wrong identity here. It's not about your DNA. It's about something more than that. And then later on the argument countered, but we've been following in the tradition of Judaism, so how can you say that we're not really getting it right? And at that point, Jesus is basically saying, you know, just because you do the rituals doesn't mean that you're a person of faith. It could be that you're way off track. Modern terminology. This isn't so much the case now at Crosswalk because our DNA has changed over the years. But I know when I first showed up here, phenomenon existed that I've seen in almost every other church I've been a part of. And that is that this idea of heritage automatically sort of qualifies you as something you may or may not be. And so I would talk to the children, grandchildren, oftentimes at funerals about faith issues, and they would tell me, oh, I'm Baptist. And I said, where do you go to church? And they'd look at me funny and say, First Baptist, because I'm the pastor of First Baptist. This is First Baptist, right? And I'd look at them and I'd be like, I've never seen you before in my life. How is it that you go to First Baptist Church when they live in town? And I realized that, and I know this from growing up too, that sometimes we get the idea that if we were once a part of the church, that somehow that is the same thing as being in faith, or that's what it's all about. Does that make any sense? And so I'd have people that, if I ask their question, even today I've got friends that say, well, what's your faith tradition? Oh, I'm Catholic. Oh, well, tell me about that. Where do you go? Oh, I don't go to church. I haven't been to church in 18 years. And it's kind of like this conversation where people are kind of owning their faith tradition, but not really quite in the faith tradition. And the danger with that is that sometimes in thinking that that is what the faith tradition is, we think we've actually immersed ourselves in faith, when maybe we've only immersed ourselves in just the most surface understanding of faith, just the beginnings of faith. And so then they go to the next level and they say, well, we practice all these things. We do all these ritualistic things that, kind of prove that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. And, I've seen this in churches too. Actually, I've seen this at this church because we've transformed so much in our time here. I would share Crosswalk's story when I was with the region and help to be encouragement to changing different things and trying different things. And I would describe what we do around here on Sunday mornings. And they'd ask me, well, what do you do with that early service? Because they heard we do something weird for our early service, which is true. Because there aren't too many services that you have no music and you're not in the sanctuary. And yet we call it our early service. And it's just meditation, announcements, and the teaching. And it's over there. It's not in here. Because it's more cozy in there with the number of people we get than it would be in here. But for some people, they're like, well, it's not church unless you're in the sanctuary, because this is the place where God shows up. And then they show up in here and take a look at this layout, and they're like, where'd you put the church? Right? We even had that. This guy cracked me up. When we were at the evacuation site last fall for the fires, or a year ago fall, you know what I mean. There was a gal who was in this space, and they were on a walkie-talkie with somebody somewhere else, and they were communicating whatever. It was before we had the cot set up in here. And the other person's asking, well, where are you? And this person, I'm guessing she was Catholic by everything I was reading off of her. And she looks around and she signals back, well, I think I'm in the cafeteria. Which I thought was hilarious. And yes, that's exactly right. This is where we break bread. This is where we come around the table. This is where we do church because it's community and all that stuff. Well, you got to understand that there are pastors that know that if they would get rid of the pews like we had, and our pews were fine. They lasted until they didn't last anymore, until they were falling apart and in trouble. But there are pastors that they shake in their boots about making changes because they know that these are holy cows. And if they barbecue these holy cows, it's going to be the end of them, so they fear. Some of them are as benign as the order of service. My first church back in Illinois, this is when I was, commuting from Chicago, every week to get this thing going. And I'm talking to the secretary who put the whole thing together. And this is back when you had to do this thing over the phone. And I'm telling her, okay, this is going to be the order of the service. And I kind of laid it out for her. And I heard silence on the other end. And I'm like, hello, are you still there, Nancy? And she says, well, it's just that we've never done it like that before. And I wanted to tell her, if you only knew what's coming, baby. But I didn't even know at that point. So anyway, those kinds of things are holy cows that eventually, this is where religion turns into religions, and we get off track, and we forget who we are, and we forget what it's all about. And it's like Jesus is saying, actually, he uses the argument right back on them. These people are saying, but we're the Abraham people. And he says, hold on. Let's just back up the truck and talk about Abraham then. Because what was Abraham doing? This is a guy who sensed a call from God directly to move from Iraq to Israel before either of those countries had names. And he sensed it because he sensed that the Spirit of God, which surprised him, wanted to do a new thing. I want to make a new people out of you. And he believed it. And when he did it, he left the rituals, most of them, behind him. Because he really believed that this new thing was a new thing. He took with him the idea of sacrifice because that's just how people back then thought, but not nearly to the scale that they did before. This was a freewheeling thing. And as Abraham was leaving his wealth and a lot of his wealth anyway, is his name, his heritage and all that, to go start this new thing, some of the initial questions he had was, as soon as I cross this range, as soon as I cross this river even, is God still going to be with me? Because everything that had been in him to that point, the orthodoxy of the day was, God is geographical. You shift to a new geography, you got to leave your old God behind and honor the God that's there. So one of the first things he had to decide was, am I going to believe in that orthodoxy or not? And he found out that God was with him all the way to Israel. Then there was famine in the land, and he heard there was food in Egypt. So he decides to go to Egypt to save his entire household. And he had to wonder, is God going to be with me all the way down to Egypt? And God was. So he's doing two things all at the same time. He's literally barbecuing holy cows because he's not barbecuing so many holy cows. And he's breaking with orthodoxy because he believes that this God who has called him is up to something new and different that is good for religion, but not religious, if that makes any sense. That's what the foundation is. And Jesus is calling back to those people who are taking issue with what he's saying. He's saying to them, if you're really going to be Abrahamic people, then be Abrahamic people. And by the way, you're looking at one, says Jesus. A guy who realized that Sabbath was made for people, not people for the Sabbath. In other words, religious law is there for our benefit to use and employ in ways that help steer us and direct us and connect us to God, and not for us to simply serve those things because it's the way it's always been done before, or believing in a certain part of orthodoxy because it's always been believed that way before. There are parts of our thinking that have been greatly formed for the last 1,600 years. Decisions were made in the 5th century, early 400s, that you did not have a say in. Decisions about what orthodoxy looked like, that you and I, if we had the opportunity to be around the table, might raise our hands and say, wow, I understand where you're coming from, but do you realize you're neglecting a whole lot of other ideas here? And you'd look at the process itself and you'd realize, okay, they are trying to nail down an orthodoxy for a new national faith. And the king is around the table, helping determine what that's going to look like. Meaning, it's going to have a lot of fingerprints over that we would not want there. One of the things that it had to put forward with us had to do with where exactly is God. And we codified ideas in different ways to suggest that God is out there and we have to do something to get God in here. And until we do that something to get God in here, we as created beings, God is not in here. So the ways that's done in evangelical churches is we tell children, we even call it the plan of salvation, and say, you need to ask Jesus into your heart. And then you know that God comes in and now you're a Christian. As if to say, God was not a part of your life, not in you, until you said that. There are Pentecostal traditions, different degrees of it, believe it in different strengths, who suggest that you cannot have the Holy Spirit in you until after you have said the magic words, I accept Jesus into my heart. And then you're not really filled with the Holy Spirit until we see specific evidence of it. In other words, if you don't speak in tongues, then you're not really filled with the Holy Spirit. These are orthodox kinds of things that unfortunately are not necessarily biblical. But Jesus wasn't necessarily biblical all the time either. The guy I was mentioning before, Paul, when he had his awakening, it blew his mind. And it totally transformed him. You got to understand, this is a guy who is steeped in orthodoxy, who believed in it so much he was willing to kill other people for it, to be a party of it. He's the guy who's holding the first Christian martyr's coat while he watches onlookers stone Stephen to death in the book of Acts. And he's okay with it. That's Saul turned Paul. And he had some relearning to do. It took him a long period of time. And when he came out of that period, he was no longer blind. He could see. And what he saw was very different than what he'd been taught up to that point. It had to do with where is God, and it helps us understand what is this truth that will set us free. And the great truth is that God, from the very beginning, has been with and in all of us. That at first you only had God, and then you have God breathing creation into being, theologically saying that an element of God, the very Spirit of God, is the creative force that is in everything that is created, down to you and me. Paul expresses this. It's been there all the time, but maybe we haven't seen it. So on the next slide, we hear Paul saying a crazy thing for a very devout Orthodox Jew to say. He says in this new life, it doesn't matter if you're Jew or Gentile. Holy cow, can you see what he just said? He said, it doesn't matter if you're Jew or Gentile? Come on, this is crazy. Circumcised or uncircumcised, it's kind of saying the same thing a different way. Barbaric, uncivilized, slave or free. Christ is all that matters, and he lives in all of us. That the presence of God is already in all of us. This presence of God, who is known as love, this animating figure who breathes everything into creation, is still a part of creation. It's not that God is the creation. The technical word for this is panentheism. Not pantheism, which is everything is God, but panentheism says that God is in everything inextricably because it has to be. And that includes you and me. Paul goes on to say in another slide, "But when God, who set me apart from my mother's womb and called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son in me already, so that I might preach him among the Gentiles, my immediate response was not to consult any human being because he knew that human beings would say, that's not orthodox." But get what he's saying. The revelation was that it was already in him. Already in. Not out, but in. We go on to the next slide, and it says, "Examine yourselves to see whether you are living in the faith. Test yourselves. Do you not realize that Jesus Christ is in you?" Because it's true. He goes on later on in the chapter, different part of the book, "Recognize that God is a living, personal presence, not a piece of chiseled stone. And when God is personally present, a living spirit, that old constricting legislation is recognized as obsolete. We're free of it, all of us. Nothing between us and God. Our face is shining with the brightness of his face. And so we are transfigured, much like the Messiah. Our lives gradually becoming brighter and more beautiful as God enters our lives and we become like him." This is the dream, is that what is in you, what is in everybody, is allowed to grow and prosper and help us become more and more the reflection of the beautiful God that we worship. That is the picture. So you might say, well, why did I say the magic words then? Why did I go to confirmation? Why did I get baptized as an infant? Or if you're in a Reformed tradition, why did I get baptized later? Why did I do all these things? Well, that's because it's for you. It's for you to make a statement, to say, I've seen the light. I figured this out, and I'm doing this. I've gone through the confirmation because it helps me understand that, yeah, I understand this, Christ within me. I take communion when we offer it because I'm agreeing, yes, I'm in this, and it's in me. That's what the whole thing is all about. How different our lives would be, how more free we would be if we really believed, first of all, that this is true. That this is true of you. That the presence of God has always, always, and forever will be in you. Part of you. You know what that does to you? That means you have inherent worth. That means if you were raised in a family that, for whatever reason, couldn't communicate that well, put conditions on it, their own sickness, their own struggle, whatever the case might be, who did not articulate in ways that you understood that you are worth, that you are of worth, that you are loved, that this news means you matter. You matter. That you never have to wonder about being loved ever again. That you are worthy of love. That is a truth that sets you free. Joni Yacko was in the first service, and I gave her a shout out because she had a great communication seminar here a few weeks ago. And one of the things that she said, which is so true, and this is coming off of her decades and decades of helping people in therapy, she said the most important thing you can have is to know that you are loved. When you know that you are loved, that is the foundation that allows everything else to grow. That's the news that sets us free. That Jesus is saying, and by the way, I mean, this is a guy, an unlikely candidate to say this stuff. This is a Jewish peasant who was happy to get a meal a day. He lived in abject poverty under the thumb of the Roman Empire. This is the last guy who would look at his life and say, yep, hey everybody, great news, we're loved by God. Everybody would look at him and say, what are you smoking? Because nothing in you says that you are loved or blessed by God. But that's the point, is Jesus is saying, I have experienced this presence of God that is absolutely love. It's true for me. It's true for you. And when you own that truth, it sets you free because you no longer need to hold the shackles of all those other labels and things that have kept you down. That's the first great thing it does. But the second great thing it does, at least, is that if you really believe that about yourself, that God is already in everybody, giving everybody inherent worth, then that means everybody you look at also has inherent worth. This is why our message is so important for the world today. Because in our country right now, things are being divided up between liberal, conservative, Republican, or Democrat, faithful, unfaithful. We're looking at each other through jaded eyes. We're looking at people as if they're in or they're out. They're not a part. We are not a part of them. There is us, and then there is them. When Jesus is saying, there's no them. There is only us. There is only us. What a remarkable difference it would make if we would begin speaking to each other as if we all had inherent value. How would it change our political discourse if instead of mudslinging, it became a substantive conversation about policies irrespective of position? How would that change the whole climate? How would it change our religious environment? How would it change votes on things that affect the lives of people, literally the lives of people? It's the truth that sets us free, that we already have Christ within. So what are we doing, as Paul says, to let it shine brighter and more beautiful? There's an author I follow. I enjoy his work. Some people have a little hard time with him because he's a type 7 on the Enneagram. He's always on the go, kind of the Energizer Bunny. But he's remarkably successful in his law work and remarkably generous with everything he does. He's a consulate to Uganda, or Uganda's consulate to the U.S., actually. It's the other way around. And he travels all over the place. We did a series based on one of his books several years ago called Love Does. And the guy I'm talking about is Bob Goff, just an extraordinary person. He wrote a book called Everybody Always, which we're actually going to build into a series this summer coming up. It's a fun, all about love and inclusion. That will be our summer thing. Summer of Love coming up, people. But he talks about, in one of his chapters, 3 minutes at a time. And he tells the story of Adrian. It says, Adrian is a man who every day was met by probably thousands of people. None of them wanted to see him, and probably all of them were grumpy. And the reason why is because Adrian worked at an airport, the San Diego airport to be specific. And while not everybody is treated with grumpy faces, he was, because he wore a TSA uniform. And he's the guy that stands at the podium as people are waiting to go through security. He's the guy that looks at your ID and your boarding pass to decide whether or not you can proceed. And if you've flown much, you know nobody's happy in that line. Everybody's checking their watch. Everybody's trying to figure out which line is moving faster after they get through. Bob Goff, who flies all the time and is in that airport practically every day, he recognized a phenomenon with Adrian, that nobody liked him and that nobody was being very pleasant. And he himself had walked past him and had his stuff checked out by Adrian many times. And then he decided to change his tune one day. And he goes up to Adrian and he says, "Hi, I'm Bob Goff," as Bob Goff would do. And he hands him his ID and his boarding pass. He says, "I just want to tell you that I just really am grateful for your work. Because when I see you treat everybody with such respect, I just think it looks a lot like the love of Jesus to me." And Adrian slowly handed back his stuff. This guy's 5 foot tall. He comes around the podium. Bob Goff's my height. And he gives Bob Goff this massive bear hug and buries his head weeping into Bob Goff's chest. So grateful that somebody acknowledged him as a human being and showed him love. This relationship was built 3 minutes at a time in the airport, turned into a friendship, turned into coffee at Bob Goff's house, turned into family relationship between the Goff family and Adrian's family, so that when he died from a massive stroke not long before he retired, it hit them all very, very hard. A relationship built 3 minutes at a time, all built on this idea that Christ is already within, that everybody is already included in the love of God. In this particular chapter, Goff shares the following words. When we draw a circle around the whole world like Grace did and say everybody is in, God's love gives us bigger identities than we used to have. With our newer, bigger identities, we can draw even bigger arcs around people's lives. We start to see that our time here isn't meant to be spent forming opinions about the people we meet. It's an opportunity to draw the kind of circles around them that Grace has drawn around us until everybody is on the inside. We don't decide who in line is in and who's out. And we don't need to waste any more time engaging in the kinds of arguments some people get sucked into. People who are becoming love don't swing at every pitch. We start by meeting people just 3 minutes at a time. This phrase that he begins this particular sentence with, people who are becoming love, that is the theme of his book. That's what Paul was saying in 2 Corinthians, is how are you becoming love? If Christ is within us all, if God is within us all, and God is recognized as love, the very embodiment and essence of love, how are you becoming love in all of its brightness, its brilliance, and its beauty? This is our calling, this is our hope, and it is so freeing. Isn't it nice to know judging the world is not your job? Isn't it nice to know you don't have to tell everybody they're losers anymore? Brian Worrell, one of the most graceful guys I know. But you get to actually be just the opposite. 3 minutes at a time, being able to see the life of God in people and be a part of calling that out. What a beautiful gift that is. What a freeing thing for us to do. The world just might change if we do it. Benediction before prayer comes up on the next screen. This is Paul writing to the Roman church. He says, "Oh, may the God of green hope fill you up with joy, fill you up with peace, so that your believing lives, filled with the life-giving energy of the Holy Spirit, will brim over with hope." Would you say it out loud with me? Oh, may the God of green hope fill you up with joy, fill you up with peace, so that your believing lives, filled with the life-giving energy of the Holy Spirit, will brim over with hope. Let's pray together. God, we are so prone to be like the people in the crowd having the argument with Jesus. It's just human nature, I guess, God, for us to settle for so much less than what you offer us. To settle for dogma, to settle for titles and labels, when you're calling us to love, to become love, to build our lives on love, to spread love as profusely as possible. God, help us remember. Help us remember that we are deeply, deeply loved, and that will never, ever change. And for some of us, this is a new idea, because all we're doing is running through the tapes of everything everybody's told us all our lives, and maybe that hasn't been lovely at all. And yet you are shouting at us in the most loving, energetic way possible, I love you, I love you, I love you. Let's build your life on that. May we say yes to that today. And as we say yes to that, may that be our call in word and deed to everyone we meet. How lovely people are, and how lovely they just might become. God, help us. Help us walk in your love. Help us be agents of your love and mercy for the sake of the world. In Jesus' name. Amen.